So, I mean, I'm a great believer that there's a conversation that takes place between good art, and Peter's work is exactly that. It is good art. And so when you hang it next to Picasso's or a Damien Hirst or something perhaps a little bit more historical, a piece of antiquity, there's a dialogue, and you can almost hear the trail ends of a conversation that takes place between the pieces and the space between the pieces.
How would I define it? It's just something I do, you know. I don't know how else to put it, really. I don't know, it's just crept up on me, really.
Peter's work is unpretentious, and there is an honesty about them.
There's a certain sort of romance attached to the idea of making sculpture. I mean, I grew up in a time when the geometry of fear was very much in the news. And what I make is not intellectual work, I don't think, but it's thoughtful work. So I'm Peter Burke, and I make sculpture. Both my parents were craftspeople, so I grew up with a respect for making, really, and an acknowledgement of craftsmanship. My father eventually left bespoke shoemaking and ran a shoe shop. In fact, the very first piece of sculpture I ever made was a piece of stone I found in bath stone I found in the cellar, and a whole lot of woodworking tools, and then I just used it as something to carve. I don't know how old I was, I think about 11 or so, might even been 10 or 9. Yeah, I don't think I would have claimed to be an artist at the time, I just was interested in doing it. And I can remember the second piece I had was very derivative of Barbara Hepworth, for example. From the age of 13 onwards, my education was purely technical. So there's great voids in my education, things like languages and literature and so on. I ended up by doing jig and tool design. It didn't matter what it looked like as long as it did the job. You know, I found that the most creative bit. But I quite like setting up a process in which there's an element of chance thrown in. And that's literally, you know, like throwing a spanner in the works. So what would be a uniform product actually ends up being quite different. I was offered a residency in California, which was just wonderful. I was really taken by the sheer beauty of the whole place, the natural beauty. And it just seemed like an affront to put something permanent there. So I made something impermanent. And the process I was looking at, things that were made by the indigenous inhabitants of California, and a lot of early American structures, housing, was made from adobe. And they think that adobe was transformed by the arrival of the Spanish, and they introduced the idea of making bricks that you could literally build a brick wall, a clay brick wall with. And what I did was to gather clay and materials around the site, and clay and grasses, and I made some adobe feet. So I chose the feet of a groundsman who his family came from Italy first of all, and he literally jumped ship, and his ancestors rather jumped ship and just took root in California. And so I took a mould of his feet and then I reproduced them, and then I left it on a path, an old logging path, going through a creek and up and out the other side. And I arranged them to be literally subsumed by natural processes. You know, this area, eventually this creek would flood in the winter and just wash it all away. Yes, I get quite harsh with the things themselves, you know, that, and sometimes if it doesn't do what I want to do, eventually I think, well, somebody's got to get the better, you know, this isn't going to get the better of me. And so I just would destroy it at that point.
I would secretly get them out of the bin. So now he throws things away and and tears them up first or breaks them up first so that I can't retrieve them. Well, I think it's all beautiful, and I love the way it's developed over the years, and yet I can see the links with the early work that I first saw when we first met when I was 21. It's a lot of the same shapes. It's gone through a lot of changes over the years, but he's come back to the same shapes and a lot of the same colours as well.
The advent of scanning and three-dimensional printing has given sculptors an enormous scope. For some people, that is sculpture, that's what I do, you know. It's a bit like photography and its effect on painting at the turn of the last century. You know, and sometimes I quite like to actually toy with that idea, exploiting another approach to using these new technologies. Well, I'm quite interested in the absences and presences, you know, the two things. I mean, just things like you're going through a junk shop and you find a box. In it, there's these velvet-lined recesses for objects. And you think, gosh, what was that for? You know, it's just a question of trying to read the negative space as to what was in there. I mean, I see a mould as a void, an absence. And my first use of them was to actually animate that space, that volume. On leaving teaching, I did a residency in a scrap metal yard. You know, there is a sort of dynamism to the actual waste process. What we throw away is particularly interesting, I think. The movement of objects through, which reflect what was going on in society. Like the conduct of society is laid bare in the scrap workshop. The end of the Cold War produced a whole lot of missiles, which was obviously, I suppose, reached their sell-by date. Various images that really stick with you, like a very early defence systems computer was brought to the scrapyard, and to dismantle it, he used an axe. And I thought that was a strange juxtaposition of weapons. Materials that went through the processing had a huge amount of latent energy within them. There was energy put in, first of all, to turn it into a car or something like that. And then it gets literally crushed again and cut up. And then this material has got a lot of life. There's a strange dichotomy, really, with the more brutally you treat metal, the more animated it becomes. Exploded shells, they've just been blown open and they look, the forms are immensely graceful. Extraordinary, really. I could take greater liberties with the male body than I could with the female body. I didn't want to, to make it look like an idea of dominance, you know, that I felt it more permissible for me to take liberties with, and myself as well, you know, that because I was utilising scanning processes and so on, at the very, very early stages, it was all so primitive and time-consuming that I had to make even a sort of Victorian photographer's clamp to actually keep me still.
I mean, his works for me fall into two categories. There's the human form, and then there's that sort of social, political, which tend to be a little bit more abstract, like the Towers as an example, his latest body of works.
Yes, and at the moment I'm actually trying to work with the implications of a human presence, you know, without any kind of reference directly to the figure.
it's nothing short of astonishing. The immediacy upon seeing Peter's work with how much they love his work. It's quite something.
But I quite like the actual supporting structures, which are not so relevant, are not so evident in this particular piece.
But I always make sure that there are a number of Peter's works installed in the gallery, and usually the closer to me and to my desk, the better.
I'm always thinking about making. I'm basically a maker, you know, and yes, making's a very big part of life for me. It's something which keeps me sane, really.